Right, now we're very pleased to welcome all the way from the US of A, Lisa VanDamme, who is one of our members. She's quite a long-standing member, and we've chatted to her on Zoom before, and she has some really excellent videos on YouTube if you want to watch them. Extremely well done, I must say. I really enjoy these videos, and she's come now to talk to us about something that she's has already spoken about on her videos. She's the founder of the VanDamme Academy, a private K-8 school in Orange County, California, where she's taught literature to junior high students for 20 years. She's also the creator of Read With Me, a program meant to help people learn to love literature and connect emotionally with the classics. Thank you, Lisa.
Should I wait for my slideshow?
Okay.
There we go. Thank you. Okay, wonderful. Let's see. Okay, it does. Good afternoon. I want to begin my talk by explaining what credentials have and have not earned me the privilege of speaking now to you. I am not, as my companions are, a Hugo scholar. I hold no advanced literary degrees, and to my great shame, after a decade of study, I still can't even speak French. What I am is the founder of a primary school in Southern California, a passionate teacher of literature, and someone who sees Victor Hugo as having changed my life and the lives of more than 2 decades of students. One of my graduates this year wrote in a card, a thank you card to me. Thank you for teaching me Gavroche's spirit, Radub's courage, and Cyrano's panache. I will carry them in my heart forever. And there's no greater tribute a teacher can have. I can tell you a little bit in the way of biographical or aesthetic scholarship about Hugo, but I can speak volumes about what I see as the spiritual impact of his books. So our theme for this weekend is Victor Hugo, the Campaigner. And I've chosen to focus on a campaign I regard as among his most formidable in spirit and lasting in its effects, Hugo's campaign for romanticism in art. It is a campaign that erupted in an event noteworthy not just in the life of Hugo, but in the whole history of French theater, and it is known as the Battle of Hernani. So I want to begin this talk by transporting you through time to the Comédie Française in Paris and giving you a front row seat to this drama, not to the one on the stage, but to the one being played out in the theater itself. Established in 1680, the illustrious Comédie Française, like the Royal Shakespeare Company in Britain, maintained the classical repertoire and set the stage for anyone serious about theater. With its classical columns, cream-colored stonework, sparkling chandeliers, golden staircases, and plush red velvet seating, the Comédie Française set a stage of dignity and elegant opulence. In the early 19th century, men in attendance at its performances would have been seen wearing swallowtail coats, black silk ties, starched neckties, and standing collars. In the words of drama critic William Hazlitt, there was a professional air, an unvarying gravity in the looks and demeanor of the whole assembled multitude. Not only was the strictest silence observed as soon as the curtain drew up, but no one moved or attempted to move. This would not be true on the night of February 25th, 1830. That evening's play was to begin at 7, but by 1 o'clock, a crowd had already gathered outside the theater. There were no starched collars in this congregation. Instead, it was, in the words of writer Mary Agnes Robinson, an assembly of several hundred shaggy and magnificent men, some in cloaks and sombreros, some in striped and high-collared waistcoats a la Robespierre. In brief, a motley carnival of youth, art, and enthusiasm. The descent of this crowd on the theater had the character of an attack, and it was countered with defenses. Theater employees stationed themselves on the roof and pelted the queue with waste from the Comédie Française kitchens. I read somewhere that the great novelist Honoré de Balzac was struck with a stalk of cauliflower. I'm not sure how that got noted for posterity, but at 3 o'clock the doors were opened and the rabble were let in. Here's how writer Graham Robb describes the scene inside. They had come equipped with bread, sausages, cheese, chocolate sticks, and oranges. They sang subversive songs, discussed the lines that would have to be cheered to victory, and, according to the fantasies of people who were not there, fornicated with their working-class girlfriends. The usherettes who held the keys to the toilets did not arrive for work until shortly before the performance. Undaunted, they dined at 5, spread out over the seats like banqueting Romans, then wandered off into dark corners. They were still eating when the rest of the audience began to trickle in, filling up the boxes, their slippers and evening dresses trailing through something moist and pungent. And the swallow-tailed and evening-dressed contingent did still come. In the weeks prior, while the play was being rehearsed, newspapers hostile to it had gone so far as to employ spies to enter by stealth into the hall of the theater and listen at the doors, and then use the information they obtained to ridicule the drama and predispose the public against it. A cabal of conservatives had petitioned the king to ban the play from the stage. A truculent old ticket lady had been hawking tickets to Hugo's enemies, trying to drum up a crowd that would hiss his play into silence. At the stroke of 7, while the author watched from the wings, Robinson says, quote, "The curtain went up and the play began before two publics absolutely hostile. The public of the boxes, with its white shoulders, its diamonds, and its good taste, and the public of the parterre and the gallery, with its shaggy locks and its startling incoherences," unquote. This is what had set the stage for the Battle of Hernani, this is what the stage had set. The debut of the play of Hernani by Victor Hugo. The battle requires a backstory. I want to begin the story when Hugo was a 14-year-old schoolboy, and a teacher who had branded him a troublemaker confiscated Hugo's private journal. The journal contained, among other things, an unflattering character sketch of that teacher, and a declaration by young Hugo that would become famous when he did. It said, "I want to be Chateaubriand or nothing." Many young writers of Hugo's time were obsessed with Chateaubriand. Essayist Alex Andriès says, quote, "Adolescent identification with this tragic master of melancholy drove many young romantics to a kind of madness," unquote. A young Lamartine, one of Hugo's contemporaries, once spent 2 full days in a tree overlooking Chateaubriand's property, just hoping to catch a glimpse of his hero. When the esteemed author finally ambled outside on his skinny legs and played in the yard with his cat, Lamartine wrote later in his journal that the sight left him dizzy with literary glory. Chateaubriand is now regarded as the father of French Romanticism. Now, while there's little scholarly consensus on how Romanticism can be defined, here, as described in A History of Modern France, are some of its elements. It judged literature without any reference to the rules or the governing taste of the time. It described nature with the knowledge of a first-hand observer and with the imagination of a poet. It gave full play to the passionate demands of individualism. And it was written in an enchanting style which was warmed by emotion and heightened by imagination, and which moved with an easy freedom. So, rebellion against the rules, imaginative descriptions, passionate individualism, and freedom of expression. These were some of the elements of early Romanticism and the spirit to which young Hugo had sworn allegiance. As it turns out, if Chateaubriand's writings can be thought of as the first flickers of Romanticism in French literature, Hugo himself is responsible for taking up that torch and turning them into a conflagration. It began with Hugo's thunderous Preface to Cromwell. Cromwell was the first of Hugo's plays ever to be produced, but the stage would be stolen by its preface. It was not just the preface to a play, it was the manifesto of a movement. Hugo, says Graham Robb, had with his preface provided the Romantic movement with the magisterial text, which, according to the poet Théophile Gautier, shone in our eyes like the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai. Let me highlight some of the elements that make this work the standard bearer for the Romantic movement. As context, it's important to know that Romanticism is in part a reactionary movement against the dogmas of classicism. The theater, and especially its paragon, the Comédie Française, was subject to strict rules of composition that it was at the time considered a sacrilege to violate. For instance, playwrights were obliged to observe the three unities of time, place, and plot. There could be only one central action. It had to take place in a single physical location, and it could occur over a period of no more than one day. In 1809, playwright Lemercier staged his Christophe Colomb, which subverted the unity of place principle by setting its action on the single location of a ship that over the course of the play traveled several thousand miles. This caused such an outrage that the actors had to perform behind a line of soldiers, and eventually the theater had to be evacuated by the National Guard. Additionally, only certain subjects were considered proper for a play. Their stories had to be drawn either from antiquity, legend, or the Bible. When the young poet Briffaut wrote a tragedy set in Spain, and the Bureau of Censorship opposed it, he had only to transport the action from Barcelone to Babylon, which both satisfied the rules for subject and conveniently maintained the meter and the rhyme, and his play was deemed acceptable. The theater also had to conform to a strict code of decorum. Tragedy, which treated royalty and nobility, and comedy, which dealt with the middle and lower classes, were not to be mixed. All plays were required to teach a moral lesson, and their themes were to be drawn from a stock list of conventional ideals. Poetic justice always had to be served, with the good rewarded and the wicked punished. Only the most elevated language was allowed, and verse plays were expected to follow absolute rules of meter and rhyme. Chateaubriand, with his defiance of codified rules, his emphasis on individualism, and his unleashing of emotion and imagination, had begun challenging the code of classicism and making room for the Romantics. Hugo's preface to Cromwell, I like to think of it as kicking down the door. It was a fight for nothing less than, in Hugo's own words, liberalism in literature. It's tempting to spend far too much time quoting from the preface to Cromwell, but I'll restrict myself to giving you the flavor of it in a few choice selections. On the topic of unity of place, the requirement that all the action of the play occur in a single location, Hugo says, quote, "The result is that everything that is too characteristic, too intimate, too local to happen in the antechamber or on the street corner, that is to say, the whole drama, takes place in the wings. We see on the stage only the elbows of the plot, so to speak. Its hands are somewhere else. Instead of scenes, we have narrative. Instead of tableaus, descriptions. Solemn-faced characters placed, as in the old chorus, between the drama and ourselves, tell us what is going on in the temple, in the palace, on the public square, until we are tempted many a time to call out to them, 'Indeed, then take us there. It must be very entertaining.'" Unity of time, Hugo says, rests on no firmer foundation than unity of place. He says, "A plot forcibly confined within 24 hours is as absurd as one confined within a peristyle. Every plot has its proper duration as well as its appropriate place. Think of administering the same dose of time to all events, of applying the same measure to everything. You would laugh at a cobbler who should attempt to put the same shoe on every foot." These, he says, are the wretched quibbles with which mediocrity, envy, and routine has pestered genius for 2 centuries past. And, I love this line, their wings have been clipped with the scissors of the unities. Here is the spirit of the preface in summary, a rallying cry to summon an army of romantics. Let us then speak boldly. The time for it has come, and it would be strange if, in this age of liberty, liberty, like the light, should penetrate everywhere except to the one place where freedom is most natural, the domain of thought. Let us take the hammer to theories and poetic systems. Let us throw down the old plastering that conceals the facade of art. There are neither rules nor models, or rather, there are no other rules than the general laws of nature, which soar above the whole field of art. There are no rules or models. There are only the laws of nature. But Hugo was not a naturalist. He didn't subscribe to the notion that art must reflect life as it is, in all its spiritless and commonplace details, without the focusing lens of ideals. Here is how Hugo himself differentiates naturalism from romanticism. He says, "It seems to us that someone has already said that the drama is a mirror wherein nature is reflected. But if it be an ordinary mirror, a smooth and polished surface, it will give only a dull image of objects with no relief, faithful but colorless. Everyone knows that color and light are lost in a simple reflection. The drama, therefore, must be a concentrating mirror, which instead of weakening, concentrates and condenses the colored rays, which makes of a mere gleam a light, and of a light a flame. Then only is the drama acknowledged by art. The stage is an optical point. Everything that exists in the world, in history, in life, in man, should be and can be reflected therein, but under the magic wand of art." In 1827, Hugo's wife reported that the preface exploded like a declaration of war against received doctrine and provoked battles in the newspaper. Those hostile to it attacked everything in it, both its ideas and its style. Its defenders were no less fiery in their attacks. Young people declared themselves energetically in favor of the theater's independence, and the preface to Cromwell became their rallying sign. That's the backstory to the Battle of Hernani. Now let's get back to the action. Word had spread that Hugo's new play, Hernani, violated the classical unities, mingled the tragic and the comic, and contained unseemly emotion in the form of repulsive groans of anguish which should be heard nowhere but in a hospital. To defend the Comédie Française from this desecration, the classicists came out in force. But the preface to Cromwell had succeeded in raising an army of young romantics who would come to the play's defense. The theater manager had agreed to admit 500 of Hugo's friends for free. So, to identify them, Hugo distributed slips of red paper stamped with the word hierro, Spanish for iron. I found somewhere in a book this image of his writing and made it into a stamp, so now I can make my own invitations. Spanish for iron and suggestive of a sword. It was a reference to the battle cry that begins a poem by Hugo that young romantics would have known by heart. Waiting in the wings, Hugo could look out upon this divided audience that represented, in the words of the poet Gautier, 2 systems, 2 parties, 2 armies, or even 2 civilizations. Hugo would later reflect that when the curtain was raised, he felt so exposed and vulnerable, it was as if the skirt of his soul were being lifted up. The classicist rules were violated with the very opening line, bringing loud hoots and hisses from the audience. In the second scene, the hero Hernani cries, "Old man, go and be measured for your coffin and leave us in peace." and the Romantics saw their own sentiments reflected in his words. They stomped their feet with such enthusiasm, it seemed the old theater might not stand. One account of events says there were fistfights, objects and insults were thrown, threats were made. The play was interrupted repeatedly. But as the play progressed, Hugo, with his magic wand of art, gained upon the audience. Agnes Robinson says, "Genius, love's young dream, and the delight of beauty are magic powers against which no politics or principles prevail." The fourth act finished in a thunder of applause. The fifth act was a triumph such as the theater has seldom witnessed. Let's dwell for a moment in that triumph. Prior to Hernani, Hugo had found himself faced with constant money cares, and when the play debuted, he was left with only 50 francs in his pocket. Before the fourth act ended, he was told that someone wished urgently to speak to him. He went outside to find a publisher waiting, who offered him 6,000 francs on the spot for the right of printing the play. Hugo wanted to defer the discussion until the next day, but the publisher said, "At the second act, I thought of offering you 2,000 francs. At the third, 4,000. I offer you 6,000 at the fourth, and I am afraid that if I wait till the fifth act, I shall be offering you 10,000. Hugo kindly accepted his offer. You recall Hugo's adolescent declaration, "I wish to be Chateaubriand or nothing"? Well, the morning after the play's debut, he found on waking the following letter. "I saw, sir, the first representation of Hernani. You are aware of my admiration of you. My vanity is attached to your lyre. You know for what reason. I am departing, sir, and you are arriving. I recommend myself to the recollection of your muse. A pious glory should pray for the dead." And it was signed, Chateaubriand. Hugo had aroused the fervent support of a legion of loyal romantics who would be known as the Hugolatres, Hugo idolaters, or as Hernanis. I must tell you about a few of the men in this colorful cast of characters. There was Théophile Gautier, mentioned before, who gave up a career in painting and switched to poetry when he read Hugo's Les Orientales, a collection of poems inspired by the Greek War of Independence. There was the writer Petrus Worel, who could recite long passages of the Preface to Cromwell by heart. I ought to do that myself. There was the artist Joseph Bouchardy, who had memorized all parts of all 5 acts of Hernani, and a favorite of mine, Gérard de Nerval, who had adapted Hugo's story Han d'Islande for the stage, and afterward could often be found at a restaurant, drinking seawater from a skull to which a brass drawer handle had been screwed, because that's what the character Han did. In Toulouse, a young man fought a duel in honor of Hernani and was killed. In Vannes, a corporal, on dying, left these words in his will. Here lies a man who believed in Victor Hugo. Change it to woman, and I'd authorize that as my epitaph. Despite the unquestionable success of the opening and Hugo's growing army of supporters, the battle would continue for many weeks. The reviews were unfavorable. It became fashionable for the classicists to go to the play and either turn their back on the stage, make a show of reading the paper, or leave the play mid-performance, slamming the door behind them. A variety of parody plays were staged throughout the city. Hugo even received death threats, and one night came home to find a bullet hole through his window. But the play's long run of performances to an enthusiastic public and the enduring success of the Romantic Revolution would prove that in this campaign, Hugo was the victor. I apologize for the pun. Romanticism would liberate the artist from the confining dogmas of classicism. It would emphasize the importance of the individual, both in the themes that artists could now take on and in their newfound freedom of expression. They no longer needed to conform to strict rules of decorum or to painstakingly avoid taboos. But neither in rejecting the grand and stilted themes of classicism did they resign themselves to naturalism, with its presentation of life as ordinary, directionless, or devoid of spiritual meaning. Writer G.K. Chesterton has a beautiful essay on Hugo, in which he calls him a man who finds meaning in everything. I'm going to share a lengthy passage from this essay which explains what he means, and which I think is in itself pure poetry. So this is Chesterton. We all know what are the uninteresting, the inevitably uninteresting parts of fiction. We all know what parts of a novel to skip. We skip the long description of the country where the hero was born, with its flat and sandy wastes. We skip the long account of the heroine's room, with its quaint old carved furniture and portraits on the wall. We skip the account of the hero's grandfather, who was so manly and honorable a lawyer in a country town. Now, the greatest and boldest tribute that can be paid to Hugo, the greatest and boldest perhaps that can be paid to any novelist, may be stated in the form that it is not safe to skip these passages in a novel by Victor Hugo. In other novelists, all these details are dead. In Hugo, they are alive. In Hugo, we may be certain that the sandy waste will be made typical in some wild way of the type and tribe of characters to which it gives birth. We may be certain that the furniture of the room will be packed with symbolism, like an antique chapel. This is no exaggeration. In this sense, it is literally true that there is not a dull line in Hugo. For to him, there is neither a large thing nor a small one. He has abolished the meanest and most absurd of all human words, the word insignificant. He knows that it is impossible for anything to signify nothing. Chesterton, in his discussion of Hugo, has drawn out the theme I'm really keen to make in this talk. Romanticism in the hands of Hugo was much more than an aesthetic movement. In campaigning for romanticism in art, he was campaigning for a romantic approach to life itself. Hugo showed us, not just in his preface to Cromwell, but consistently across all his work, how to live, love, and breathe like romantics. He taught us how to find the ideal in the everyday. He showed us, to borrow words from Graham Robb, that we could live in the prosaic modern world without emotional compromise. And in doing so, he encouraged us all to take a romantic outlook on reality. The Battle of Hernani was about more than artistic liberation. The Romantic movement was about ennobling the individual spirit and finding beauty and meaning not over and above everyday life, but deep within the fabric of it. Reflecting on the figures who fought for Hernani, it occurred to me that the character of this rebellion was inspired and guided by the very thing they were defending. Romantic art had helped fashion these young rebels into romantics. That, I think, is why the works of Hugo created the Hugolatres and the Hernanis, and why a stilted Parisian theater became a literal battleground. The Romanticists did not depend on antiquity, legend, or the Bible to achieve a grandeur of theme. Their stories wove the everyday with a fervent pursuit of values. And consequently, those who are inspired by them learn to take a value-oriented approach to their own daily existence, to find the ideal within the everyday, to live in the prosaic world without emotional compromise, to take a romantic outlook on reality. They learned to love with such a lusty spirit and lack of inhibition that they would spend 2 days in a tree watching for their idol, defy the swallow-tailed in their scarlet velvet, drink seawater from a skull cup, and fight a duel in Hugo's name. This romantic spirit is something I fear is being lost to modern society. And I'm doing my part to keep it alive by keeping Hugo's works alive, by making them the capstone experiences in my own literature classrooms. I mentioned Hugo's success at stirring the romantic spirit among his contemporaries, but I can't leave until I tell you about his success in inspiring and an eminently notable follower, the great poet and playwright Edmosd Rostand, author most famously of the play Cyrano de Bergerac. I have hanging in my living room a 6-foot-tall version of this that was an original poster from the first performance of the play. A few years ago, I learned that Rostand was also the author of a poem called Un soir à Hernani. I apologize for my French accent. A 20-page tribute to Victor Hugo and to the importance of the play Hernani. This poem has never been translated into English. So, together with my friend Antoine, who's here with us in the audience, I've been working on a translation. More on that poem in a moment, but first just a little about Rostand himself. Like Hugo, Rostand had found himself at odds with the literary spirit of his age. Naturalism, with its blunt realism, spiritless practicality, and cynical point of view, was edging out romanticism in the theater. High ideals, tender sentiments, and poetic expression were made to seem ridiculous or contrived. Art, Rostand's contemporaries believed, was meant to capture real life and all its prosaicness. And like Hugo before him, Rostand would put up a valiant fight to preserve the spirit of romanticism. In Rostand's time, the phrase fleur bleue, blue flower, was used to designate someone starry-eyed and sentimentally romantic. Biographer Sue Lloyd says, Rostand came to see it as his mission in life to sow the small blue flowers of idealism amongst the materialism and cynicism of his own generation. Rostand and Hugo were kindred romantic spirits, and Rostand revered Hugo as one of his great heroes. He would have counted himself among the Hernanis and the Hugo-latras. In 1902, the editor of the French newspaper Le Gaulois reminded Rostand that February 26th would mark the centenary of Hugo's birth. He suggested that Rostand celebrate the occasion with a visit to Hernani, which was not far from Rostand's Basque home, Arnaga, and commemorate it with a poem. Rostand liked the idea, and the next day he and his wife Rosamond set off to see the Spanish city. While they were there, a tour guide took them to the study, where, he said, Hugo had penned his famous play. Rostand knew that in reality, Hugo had only glimpsed this Spanish village, for which his play's hero was named, when he passed through it briefly as a child. For months, I have spent what spare moments I could find translating this exquisite poem, and I have to share a few excerpts with you here. I think it captures beautifully the effects of Hugo's campaign for romanticism in art and his deeper campaign for a romantic approach to life. Because this poem is at once a tribute to Hernani as a turning point for romanticism, a paradigm of romantic art itself, and a flamboyantly joyful, passionate, reverential demonstration of what it means to worship beauty, to find the ideal in the everyday, and to live like a romantic. It is at once a tribute to Hugo, and I think a demonstration that what he fought for still survived. The poem begins, that's my inscribed copy of Un soir à Hernani. The poem begins with Rostand pointing across a valley and asking a gruff old peasant, "What is that village?" But he thinks to himself, I knew with what proud and trisyllabic word, which would suddenly give glory to the air, this haughty old shepherd was about to answer. It was only a pious thrill that I sought, to be told, in this place, through this man, at this hour, told that name that feels like the brush of wings. He wanted only to hear the man say, in his sonorous Basque accent, that word so significant in the life of Hugo and in the history of art, Hernani. Later, Rostand reflects that since he cannot be in Paris to celebrate the centenary of Hugo's birth, this humble Spanish village, which so little knows of its own importance, will have to serve as his place of worship instead. He says, "Oh, I will not enjoy the pomp of an official procession, but simply the fading hillside and the stars brightening the sky. There, a little French breeze on this February evening will rustle through the juniper and blow among the larch. A pilgrim intoxicated with the hope of being blessed, I long to be there when this breeze blows over Hernani." Still later in the poem, Rostand describes Hernani as marked with Hugo's magic figure, and he expresses regret that Hugo did not make it his place of exile. He says, "I see the rock of Santa Barbara stand bitterly, and I almost regret gazing on this sight so Hugo-esque that when we exiled you, you did not come, Prince of Hernani, to live on this naked rock." And he adds, "This haughty village will always be yours. It belongs no more to Spain. It belongs not to its king. By laying upon it the claw of a poem, you seized this village from Don Carlos himself." Rostand then dreams the details of Hugo's childhood voyage through the village of Hernani. He imagines the moment when Madame Hugo steps from the coach whose horses breathe heavy, takes in her arms the warmly bundled child, and says distractedly, in a voice half asleep, "You see, it is Hernani." In that moment, Rostand says, the name Hernani settles in Hugo's soul. And when, later, he draws it out, it will come with a whole work of art. That gives you just a taste of this exquisitely reverential and unapologetically romantic tribute to Hugo and Hernani. So I'll close by mentioning that this poetic pilgrimage Hugo had inspired Rostand to take inspired me, in turn, to take one of my own. Not this one, which also would be, but a different one. I visited Rostand's exquisite home in the Basque country, Arnaga, and spent 3 full days exploring every corner of it. There I saw, among other things, lording over Rostand's majestic, oh, that's me in front of the house. Very happy, as you can probably tell. Lording over these majestic gardens, which have earned it the name Little Versailles, a bust of his hero, Victor Hugo. I visited also Hernani, which is now far from a humble peasant village, but I could still revel in standing on the spot where, as Rostand says in his poem, "Between the beams of a narrow street, where we drink dark wine from leather pouches beneath a band of indigo, Spain met Victor Hugo." And as I was driving back to my hotel, I made a stop at the Chateau d'Urtuby, which I had recalled was also mentioned in Rostand's poem. I just saw a sign for it driving down the highway and remembered it from the poem. So I pulled off. The line in the poem is, "They will soon arrive at the Chateau d'Urtuby, whose slate armor is incessantly polished by some sudden diluvian downpour." When I arrived, mine was the only car in the parking lot. I had to knock at the door to get the tour guide to let me in. She took me around the property and meanwhile told me the history of the chateau, including the fact that it has been in the same family since 1341. The current owner is the 24th in the family line. I mentioned to the tour guide that I had been brought there by Hugo, who had brought Rostand, who had referred to it in his poem Un soir à Hernani. She said she had never heard of the poem that I mentioned and did not know it contained such a reference. And she wasn't sure that the owner of the chateau knew either. So she took pictures of the poem and promised she would write to me after she spoke to the owner and let me know. A few weeks later, I received a letter that said, "Dear Lisa, I had the pleasure to show you around the Chateau d'Artuby last week. You mentioned Edmosd Rostand's poem and that our castle was mentioned in it. I passed the message to the owner, and he admitted that he wasn't aware of it. So now you are a part of the guided tour. In the small drawing room is what I attach as a picture. I tell the visitors about a passionate American who came to the castle thanks to Edmosd Rostand and let us discover something special." That was one of the great literary thrills of my life, and it's the perfect place to close the circle of this talk. Hugo was a campaigner for romanticism in art and the romantic sense of life. He effected a revolution in his own time. He fueled many an artist who followed him, and his books endure as models of what it means to find meaning in everything. I carry that spirit into my classroom, and I hope that we all here this weekend are inspired to serve as foot soldiers, carrying Hugo's campaign for romanticism across the globe and into the future. Thank you.